Most women don't realize the quiet war they're fighting until one day they wake up and feel like a ghost inside their own skin, smiling, nodding, pleasing, while something sacred inside them quietly bleeds out. She was one of them, trained since girlhood to be soft, agreeable, good, not powerful, not sovereign, not whole. Her shame wasn't loud. It didn't scream in her ears. It whispered in the choices she made, in the silence she swallowed, in the way she apologized for simply existing. And so she performed, for love, for safety, for a place in a world that told her being chosen was more valuable than being conscious. But beneath the surface of that performance lived something ancient, something no one could domesticate. She was not born to be the mirror. She was born to be the fire. There's a reason shame lingers in the soul like rot, because shame isn't just a feeling, it's a binding spell. A psychic cage forged by every unmet gaze, every unmet need, every moment a woman was told you are too much, or not enough. Shame is the parasite that convinces her to shrink when she should rise, to chase when she should rest, to overgive when her heart is already breaking. But she didn't always recognize it for what it was. Shame wears many faces. Sometimes it sounds like, "Don't be dramatic." Sometimes it smiles while saying, "You're so lucky to have him." And sometimes it seduces with a whisper, "You're not worthy until you're wanted." But something happens when the mask cracks. She had spent years contorting herself into the shape of his desires, mistaking attention for affection and chemistry for compatibility. She called it love, but it was something else, an unconscious reenactment of the oldest wound. The feminine need for validation twisted by the masculine need for control. And so she stayed, in the gray space between being adored and being discarded. Her nervous system rewired to the highs and lows of emotional chaos. Her worth reduced to how often he texted back, how many seconds he held her, how little she needed to be reassured. This wasn't a relationship, it was a spiritual regression. What she couldn't see at first was that her desperation for closeness was rooted in abandonment, not attraction. Jung called it the shadow, the part of the psyche where everything we reject, suppress, or deny gets buried. She had cast her shame into the shadow, hoping that if she just smiled wider, worked harder, loved deeper, it would all disappear. But the shadow never vanishes. It waits, and one day it rises. Her turning point wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, a morning like any other. The mirror didn't lie. Her face looked the same, but something behind her eyes was different. The ache wasn't louder. It was just undeniable. No more bargaining with ghosts. No more trying to extract love from places it was never born. No more explaining her worth to anyone too deaf to hear it. That was the day the archetype woke up in her. The high priestess. The one who remembers. The one who sees through illusion. The one who no longer chases love but channels power. She didn't need a sword. Her silence became her rebellion. Her absence became her roar. Because the woman who reclaims herself becomes terrifying to those who built their control on her shame. Her boundaries confused them. Her softness without submission enraged them. But she didn't flinch. She wasn't performing anymore. Have you ever felt that moment? When the person who once held your soul in their hands becomes irrelevant. That is the death of shame. Not because she screamed, but because she remembered. She was never broken, just buried under years of self-abandonment, guilt, and emotional caretaking. She had been living inside someone else's myth, one where women were only as valuable as their obedience. But her body remembered another story, one of sovereignty, stillness, sight. That is what made her unstoppable, not her rage, but her remembering. And when she remembered, she stopped apologizing. Stopped explaining why she needed space. Stopped justifying her tone or her vibe or her energy. She became unapologetically sacred, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because she no longer needed permission to exist. Some people tried to pull her back, called her selfish, cold, difficult, But what they were really saying was, you are no longer easy to control. Her smile became dangerous. Her silence became holy. Her distance became law. She wasn't interested in healing for the sake of being more lovable. She was healing to become more whole. The kind of woman who can walk away from anyone who confuses her softness for weakness. The kind of woman who knows that loyalty without self-respect is just emotional enslavement. The kind of woman who no longer feels guilty for saying no. And still, the world wasn't ready for her. Because a woman who no longer runs from herself cannot be manipulated by anyone else. That's why shame is so potent, because it does us hurt it hides. It takes a woman's wild intuition and turns it into anxiety. It takes her sensitivity and twists it into self-doubt. It tells her that her deepest truth is too much, too loud, too intense. So she becomes the good girl, the cool girl, the low-maintenance girl, but she pays for it with her soul. Until she stops, until the cost is too high, until she sees her shame for what it truly is, a lie disguised as loyalty. That's when everything changes. That's when the priestess walks back into her temple, barefoot and burning. And if you're listening closely, maybe you're feeling it now. Maybe something in you is stirring, cracking, remembering. The part of you that always knew your silence was not your nature. Your rage was not your flaw. Your longing was not your weakness. Maybe shame has been living in your mirror, your relationships, your nervous laughter. But shame cannot survive where truth is spoken. And the truth is this: you were never too much. You were simply never seen by someone deep enough to hold you. She did not become unstoppable because she was fearless. She became unstoppable because she stopped betraying herself to be loved. In the beginning, she mistook her own empathy for weakness. She thought the ache to understand others was a burden, that her longing for connection, for depth, for truth, was somehow naive. But that was never her flaw, it was her superpower. What broke her was not her desire to love. It was the way she twisted herself into smaller and smaller shapes so others wouldn't feel threatened by the size of her soul. There's a moment in every woman's life when the performance begins to crack. Not because she suddenly wants revenge, but because her body can no longer bear the weight of her disowned truth. That truth doesn't scream. It whispers, in migraines, in tight chests, in sleepless nights and the pit in her stomach when she says yes but means no. It's a silent rebellion. A rebellion against every time she smiled to stay safe. Against every time she dimmed her light so he wouldn't feel insecure. Against every time she carried someone else's emotions while abandoning her own. And then one day she stops. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Clarity born in the furnace of disappointment. The kind of disappointment that strips illusions. The kind that makes her see clearly that he never loved her, not really. He loved the version of her that didn't challenge his ego. He loved her submission, her silence, her self-doubt. He loved how she never made him face himself. But she was never meant to be a mirror for anyone's comfort. She was meant to be a mirror of truth. And the truth is what the world fears most in a woman who speaks her need without shame, a woman who walks away without making a scene, a woman who cries, then rises without bitterness. Because that kind of woman cannot be owned. She cannot be seduced by breadcrumbs. She cannot be kept in cages made of guilt. She had once thought love was something she had to earn, but now she knew real love does not require her to disappear. Her journey was not linear. Healing never is. There were days she still ached for the ghost of him, days when she questioned everything, but she no longer collapsed into that ache. She could hold it now, like a mother holds a crying child, with presence, with breath, with love. That's the power of the woman who's done the inner work. She doesn't need to destroy what hurt her. She simply refuses to carry it anymore. And as she let go of him, she met herself again. Not the version shaped by survival, but the woman she was before the world taught her to be small. The woman who could sit in silence and not fear it, who could ask for what she needed without trembling, who could feel her anger without making herself wrong. The world had always warned her not to go too deep, but depth was her nature. She was the ocean pretending to be a puddle, and when she stopped pretending, her waters rose. They rose through the cracks of every fake smile. They rose through the crevices of every trauma bond. They drowned the idea that her worth was transactional. They swallowed the lies, the shame, the stories that told her she was only lovable when she was convenient. And in their place, something ancient emerged. A knowing, a sovereignty, a stillness that made people nervous, because a woman who no longer seeks approval is ungovernable. The men who once played with her now stood confused. The same games no longer worked. The manipulation bounced off her. The guilt tactics fell flat. They couldn't read her anymore because she was no longer performing. She wasn't trying to be understood. She wasn't trying to be chosen. She was choosing herself, and that confused them more than any insult could. You see, when shame loses its grip, the entire energetic dynamic shifts. Before, she felt addicted to the roller coaster, the high when he came close, the crash when he pulled away, her nervous sizz. Tim called it passion, but it was just trauma on repeat. Now that same chaos repulsed her, not because she was numb, but because she was healed. Her system no longer craved pain, it craved peace, stability, real intimacy. And that terrified those who had fed on her confusion. There's nothing more threatening to a manipulator than a woman with clarity. She no longer chased closure. She realized closure was an illusion created to keep her tethered. She didn't need his apology to forgive. She didn't need his validation to trust her memory. She didn't need his affection to feel beautiful. She understood now. The closure she was seeking was really just her own self-respect, waiting to be reclaimed. So she let the silence speak, let the distance grow, let the absence carve space for truth. The high priestess within her did not rage, though she had every reason to. She did not retaliate, though she had the power. She simply watched, witnessed, waited, and walked. Because that is what real power looks like. Not volume, not vengeance, but the ability to walk away from anything that insults your soul and never look back. And now, if you're still listening, ask yourself, who would you become if shame no longer ran your life? What would you say? What would you demand? What would you release if the cage of being good cracked open and your full truth stepped forward? Because that moment is coming, not someday, soon. And when it does, you'll remember what she remembered. Your power was never in their hands. It was always in your refusal to abandon yourself. Not all storms come to destroy. Some come to reveal. That's what her collapse was. It wasn't her breaking, it was her rebirth. A shattering of every false identity shame had draped across her like a veil. The cool girl who never complained. The understanding partner who tolerated neglect. The strong woman who never needed help. These were masks she wore so she wouldn't be rejected, left, or labeled too emotional. But every mask carried a cost. And in the silence after the final betrayal, she finally asked the question most never dare to ask. Who am I without the performance? At first, the answer terrified her. She didn't recognize the woman beneath the roles. She had been so fused with other people's expectations that her own essence felt like a stranger. But instead of running from that unfamiliarity, she leaned in, sat with it, felt the fear without flinching. That's when she began to see clearly. The self she was meeting wasn't new. She was original. The one before shame, before comparison, before betrayal taught her to withhold. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating not just the light but the shadow, the wounds, the rage, the unmet needs. And that's what she began to do, not overnight, but day by day, layer by layer. She stopped performing strength and started embodying it. Her voice changed, not louder, truer, no longer seeking to be liked, now aligned with something deeper. Her eyes sharpened. They no longer looked for who might approve, they scanned for who might honor. And her energy, oh, it became a force. Not a wave crashing to be seen, but a current that could not be ignored. This terrified people, because the woman who no longer trades her peace for attachment becomes unshakable. She no longer felt responsible for soothing the insecurities of others at the expense of her own truth. If someone needed her to be small so they could feel big, they no longer had access. If someone mistook her compassion for weakness, they learned otherwise. She wasn't cold, she was clear. And clarity in a woman feels like danger to those who rely on her confusion. Once she would have tried to explain her shift, justify her new boundaries, ease their discomfort, but not anymore. She realized explanation is often the currency women are guilted into spending when they choose themselves. Now, she simply let her absence speak what her words no longer needed to. The woman who knows her worth does not debate it. That's when the invitation started to shift. No more breadcrumb attention. No more emotionally unavailable men dressed as spiritual partners. No more friendships based on how useful she could be. When she changed her frequency, the people who thrived on her self-abandonment disappeared. They didn't leave because she became too much. They left because she was no longer willing to be less. And in their absence, something else arrived. Stillness, spaciousness, truth. Not the kind shouted from rooftops, but the kind whispered in dreams. She began to remember the language of her own intuition, not anxiety, not projection, but knowing. That sacred inner compass that shame had muted. The one that said, "This path is yours," and you never needed to ask permission to walk it. But here's the part most people don't understand. When a woman sheds her shame, she doesn't just change herself. She changes the field around her. Her presence becomes medicine. Her absence becomes consequence. She doesn't need to convince anyone of her power. Her peace is the proof. And that's the thing about true feminine energy. It's not in the chase, the seduction, or the submission. It's in the rootedness, the stillness that says, "I choose, I discern, I allow in only what aligns." That kind of woman cannot be manipulated, because she no longer fears her own loneliness. She's made peace with it, transformed it into solitude, into a sacred place where her soul can breathe without distortion. And when you can sit with yourself in your fullness, with all your longing, grief, joy, and rage, and not flinch, you become unreachable to those who prey on your doubt. It didn't make her bitter, it made her wise. Wisdom doesn't always look like enlightenment. Sometimes it looks like silence, like blocking the number and not looking back, like deleting the message and not spiraling, like watching someone fumble your absence and not offering them a second chance to do it again. And no, she didn't lose her softness. She just stopped weaponizing it against herself. Her empathy became discernment. Her loyalty became boundaries. Her forgiveness became distance. Because love without boundaries is not love, it's martyrdom. She had loved before from a wounded place. Now she would love from a whole one. The difference, before she lost herself in love, now she found herself through it. So if you're listening and you feel the stir of something rising, the ache in your bones that says, "I can't keep betraying myself to feel safe," know this. Your shame is not a flaw, it's a signal, a flare from the shadow saying, "This is not your truth." You don't need to eradicate it. You need to meet it, hold it, speak to it with the voice you were told was too loud, because shame loses its grip the moment you stop agreeing with it. And the moment you stop agreeing is the moment you remember. You are not here to be digestible. You are not here to be likable. You are here to be whole. So ask yourself, what would your life look like if you stopped apologizing for your own power? She no longer feared the silence. In fact, she began to crave it. Because in the silence, there were no masks, no games, no noise trying to convince her that she needed to be someone else to be worthy. Silence became her sanctuary, the sacred space where the fragmented parts of her began to return. Not because someone rescued her, but because she stopped abandoning herself. This was the secret no one taught her. That self-abandonment is the root of every toxic relationship she tolerated. It wasn't just about him or them, or the betrayals she endured. It was about the moment she chose someone else's comfort over her own truth. The moment she said yes, while her soul whispered no. The moment she made herself small to fit inside someone else's fear. That's what shame does. It doesn't just make you question yourself, it rewrites the entire story. Turns survival into loyalty, turns emotional starvation into romance. It makes dysfunction feel familiar, and familiarity feel safe. But safety at the cost of your truth is just a prettier prison. She began to see it. Every time she was ignored and stayed. Every time she was diminished and justified it. Every time she chased, begged, performed, she was unconsciously confirming the lie. I am not enough unless I'm chosen. But when shame dies, that lie is burned at the root. She began to walk differently, move differently. Her eyes no longer scanned rooms for approval. They scanned for alignment. She no longer asked, will they love me? She asked, do they see me? Do they respect me? She didn't just change her standards. She changed her identity. No longer the girl who waited. No longer the woman who begged. No longer the healer trying to fix a man by becoming smaller and quieter. She was no one's rehab. She was the altar. And only the worthy may approach the altar. But this transformation didn't come without grief. She grieved the years she lost. Grieved the parts of herself she gave away too cheaply. Grieved the little girl inside her who just wanted to be seen without being used. This grief wasn't weakness. It was sacred. It was the rite of passage every empowered woman must walk. Because until you grieve who you had to be to survive, you can't fully become who you were born to be. She let the grief wash over her. She let the tears come, not as a breakdown but as a cleansing. And in that surrender, she found something she never expected. Peace. Not the shallow kind that comes from temporary validation, but the deep anchored peace that says, I would rather be alone than in the company of someone who requires my self-betrayal. That was the moment shame lost its grip forever. Not because she fought it. Not because she shouted affirmations into the void. But because she stopped feeding it. She no longer made herself wrong for feeling deeply. She no longer apologized for needing space. Clarity, consistency. She no longer accepted crumbs and called it dinner. She understood now, her standards were not too high. Her soul was simply no longer available for low vibrations. People noticed. Some resented it. They missed the version of her they could manipulate, pacify, dismiss. But she didn't flinch. Because the woman she became wasn't for them. She was for the version of herself she abandoned. She was for the woman in the mirror who cried in silence for years. She was for the future daughter who would never have to question her worth. She was for every woman who has ever been called too emotional, too needy, too much. She was for the divine feminine, rising. And maybe, just maybe, she was for you too. You who is listening now. You who has dimmed your light so others could shine. You who has bent yourself into versions of yourself just to be tolerated. You who has confused attachment for love, attention for affection, and intensity for intimacy. If you've been there, if you're still there, then hear this. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not dramatic. You are not too sensitive. You are powerful. You are sacred. You are becoming. This is your call to rise, to return to the woman you were before the world told you who to be, to the high priestess within, the one who doesn't perform, the one who doesn't beg, the one who doesn't shrink. She simply knows her worth, knows her limits, knows that anything built on the need to be less is already dying. So let the old identity die. Let the relationships built on your silence fade. Let the parts of you born from shame return to dust. Because when they fall away, something else will rise. Your voice, your power, your truth. And the woman who lives in truth cannot be tamed. There is a threshold every woman must cross when she decides her soul is no longer for sale. It doesn't look heroic. It looks quiet. It looks like deleting the number and not checking if they noticed. It looks like sitting in loneliness without reaching for the familiar pain that once felt like love. It looks like staring at her own reflection, not to criticize but to remember. This is the death of the false self, the version of her that was built in reaction to the world, not in alignment with her spirit. The girl who learned to survive by becoming what others needed her to be, desirable, flexible, agreeable. She didn't choose that mask out of weakness. She chose it out of necessity. Because the world rarely makes space for women who are sovereign, wild, and unapologetically whole. But she was done surviving. Now she would choose something else, wholeness over approval, depth over performance, integrity over belonging. And that's when the final shift came. She no longer tried to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding her. She no longer explained her standards to people who treated her boundary as negotiable. She no longer gave second chances to those who weaponized her softness against her. Because once a woman returns to herself, there is no going back. Her energy became a filter. It repelled everything born of insecurity and ego. It confused those who were used to accessing her through guilt or chaos. It disturbed the people who had grown comfortable with her dimness. But she didn't owe anyone access to the version of her that no longer existed. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She was simply done. Done with half-truths and almost loves. Done with emotional breadcrumbs. Done with earning connection through self-erasure. What she wanted now was sacred. Reciprocity. Emotional maturity. Resonance, a stillness. She no longer confused being wanted with being valued. She no longer confused chemistry with compatibility. She had sat in the fires of her own loneliness long enough to understand that solitude wasn't a punishment. It was her initiation. And what emerged from those ashes could not be touched. The woman who chooses herself becomes a force of nature. Not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. Her peace speaks volumes. Her presence recalibrates every room she enters, not because she demands it, but because she embodies it. She was no longer the storm waiting to be rescued. She was the eye of the storm, centered, clear, untouchable. That kind of woman becomes magnetic, not to attention seekers or emotional addicts, but to those who have met themselves in the dark and no longer fear intimacy. Because her presence says, without words, "If you cannot meet me where I am, do not ask me to descend." She wasn't interested in playing games anymore. She didn't need to chase, seduce, or prove. She knew what is aligned will flow. What is meant will respect. What is real will stay. And if it didn't, she let it go. Because what she gained in return was too precious to trade: herself. Her own approval. Her own peace. Her own power. So many women stay trapped in shame because they've never seen what it looks like to walk free. But now you have. Now you feel it. And maybe somewhere deep in your chest, something is stirring. The truth you've been burying. The tears you've been swallowing. The rage you've been repressing. The desire you've been told is too much. Let it rise. Let it breathe. Let it burn. Because shame only survives in silence. And you, beloved, were not born to be silent. You were born to speak thunder in a room full of whispers. So stop waiting for permission. Take up space. Say what you mean. Set the boundary. Leave the room. Raise your standards. Honor your body. Trust your knowing. Not for them. For you. Because when shame loses its grip, what remains is truth. And truth is not always comfortable, but it is liberating. The woman who lives in truth does not chase. She chooses. She creates. She calls in. Not from fear, not from lack, but from the sacred knowing that she is already whole. So if you remember nothing else, remember this. You are not here to earn love. You are here to embody it. And so it came to pass that what once controlled her no longer even touched her. The need to explain, gone. The urge to prove, gone. The ache to be wanted by the wrong hands, gone. Because now she remembered. She remembered what it meant to be whole before the world fractured her. Before the betrayals, the gaslighting, the soft-spoken abuse dressed as love. She remembered what it felt like to trust herself without second-guessing. To wake up and know that she didn't need to perform womanhood to be worthy of it. To be fully inside her body, not as an object, not as a currency, but as a temple, sacred, sovereign, unshakable. The world may try to call her cold now, detached, unreachable, but that's only because she no longer flinches when someone withdraws love. She no longer equates abandonment with her own unworthiness, because she understands something most never dare to learn. A person's inability to love her deeply has nothing to do with her capacity to be loved. Their projections, not hers to carry. Their silence, not hers to decode. Their confusion, not hers to solve. There is nothing more terrifying to the wounded masculine than a woman who no longer needs his validation. Not because she's numb, but because she's healed. She doesn't need to be saved, taught, tamed, or chased. She needs to be met, fully, without pretense, without power games, without the performance of emotional depth that so many use as bait. She no longer feeds on potential. Potential does not impress her. Potential doesn't build a life. Potential is what she clung to when she still believed she had to earn love by fixing someone else. But now she looks for presence, for integrity, for embodiment. And when those things aren't there, she simply leaves. No drama, no explanations, just leaves. Because silence is her boundary now. Distance is her closure. Peace is her protest. Her old self would have begged, would have wept, would have written essays to men who barely knew how to spell commitment. She would have justified their behavior with empathy and called it love. But now she knows. Real empathy doesn't require self-abandonment. Real love doesn't require pain. And real connection never asks her to become less so someone else can feel like more. She has become what the feminine was always meant to be, untouchable by anything that doesn't bow to truth. She still cries, still feels, still aches, but none of those emotions make her weak. They make her alive, fully, powerfully, beautifully alive. And aliveness is the one thing shame cannot survive, because shame needs silence, secrecy, self-loathing. But aliveness shines light on every shadow and says, "You no longer rule me." And now she walks with the sacred arrogance of a woman who's no longer confused about her worth. She doesn't hate the ones who hurt her. She blesses them for what they taught her, not because they deserved her grace, but because she deserved her freedom. She stopped waiting for apologies, stopped craving redemption arcs. She stopped clinging to the fantasy that one day they'd come back and say, "You were right, you were everything," because she doesn't need to be right anymore. She needs to be free. Freedom for her looks like deep rest, like nervous system regulation, like joy without hypervigilance, like peace that doesn't require an explanation. And maybe now you see yourself in her. Maybe now you realize this was never just about her. This was always about you. You who have tolerated the emotional crumbs of the world. You who have confused suppression with strength. You who have apologized for taking up space in your own life. You are the woman she once was, and you are the woman she has become. And maybe, just maybe, the grip of shame is loosening now. Maybe you're starting to see that the pain wasn't your punishment, it was your portal. Maybe the heartbreak was the hammer that cracked the shell of your false self. Maybe the silence you feared is where your truth has always lived. So let this be your beginning. Let this be your vow, that you will no longer shrink to make others comfortable, that you will no longer chase what wounds you, that you will no longer trade your soul for scraps. Let the high priestess within you rise, not to be worshipped, but to be witnessed, to be honored, to be whole. This is the initiation, not to perfection, but to presence, not to power over others, but to power within yourself, to the kind of self-respect that no longer begs, explains, or negotiates with shame. Because shame, beloved, was never yours to carry. And the moment you put it down, you'll feel it. The soft pulse of your own sacred power. The breath of the woman you were before the world tried to rewrite you. The voice that says, "You are not broken. You are becoming." So speak your truth. Stand in your light. Reclaim every piece of yourself you once gave away to be loved. And never again confuse the act of being chosen with the act of being seen. Share the moment you felt most empowered in the comments below. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.